They were known across the spiral arms as the unquestioned masters of terror, the ones who had never once tasted defeat. To most civilizations, they were not merely an empire but a living force of nature, the inevitable end awaiting any species that dared climb too high. The Kryval Dominion was not a single race but a coalition of predators, united by their creed that the galaxy existed only to feed their hunger for conquest. Where others built alliances on diplomacy or trade, the Kryval bound themselves together by blood, dominance, and the thrill of the hunt. Each of their kind had evolved as apex killers on their homeworlds, and together they became a tide that swept aside anything that stood before them. Their history was etched in the silence of dead worlds. Planets that once sang with culture and science now lay in ash and ruin, their populations enslaved or exterminated for sport. They thrived on the scent of fear, for fear was the key that unlocked submission before battle was even joined. Entire fleets had surrendered at the mere arrival of their banners, and worlds capitulated after only hearing recordings of their war cries. For over 1,000 years, no empire had withstood them. They had become a myth that children of weaker races whispered about in hushed voices, a darkness that stalked the stars. Their physiology alone embodied terror. Some of them were towering reptilians with jaws that could shear steel, others insectoid monstrosities with claws designed to rip through bone, and still others lupin hunters that moved faster than most prey could comprehend. Each species specialized in a different aspect of war, but together they formed a machine of annihilation. In orbit, their fleets carried weapons so advanced they could shatter continents from high atmosphere. On the ground, their soldiers stalked prey like wild animals, enjoying the screams that echoed through ruined cities. They did not simply fight wars, they performed them, turning every campaign into a demonstration of dominance. The Dominion's council chambers were filled with arrogance, voices heavy with the certainty of predators who had never been denied. They spoke of prey as resources, not lives, and discussed conquest as though it were inevitable harvest. Among themselves, they boasted of past victories, competitions in cruelty, and wagers on how quickly the next target would fall. Fear had become currency, and they traded it as easily as others bartered minerals or water. To them, there was no possibility that fear would ever fail them. Subjugated species remembered differently. Survivors told stories of how the Kryval arrived suddenly, filling skies with shadow, demanding surrender with promises of mercy that never came. They recalled how resistors were hunted, how children were taken as trophies, and how monuments of broken bones were raised as warnings. Entire generations lived with the weight of that memory, too afraid to speak rebellion, too conditioned to even dream of freedom. Fear was not only a weapon, it was the foundation of Kryval rule. Yet for all their certainty, for all the centuries of dominance, a whisper of change crept at the edges of their empire. Scouts reported a new discovery, a system on the rim where a young species had begun spreading from their cradle world. Primitive by Dominion standards, lacking fleets of size, lacking weapons of true power. They were called humans, and to the Kryval, they seemed laughably insignificant. The council dismissed the report with a wave of their claws and fangs. Another prey species to be absorbed, another banner to hang in the gallery of the conquered. Still, there was something curious in the reports that came from the first long-range observations. Humans had risen not by hiding from their predators but by becoming predators themselves. Their history was filled with wars that burned continents, weapons that could end civilizations even before they touched the stars. Unlike most prey, they did not shy away from conflict but seemed to thrive in it, building identities and cultures around the notion of struggle. The Kryval warlords chuckled at the idea, amused that such a fragile race believed themselves fierce. In their eyes, humanity's legacy was not remarkable but pitiful, a child pretending at savagery in a galaxy that already knew the masters of death. Still, scouts noted their eyes, captured in stolen transmissions and recordings. Cold, calculating, unblinking in the face of disaster. Where most species recoiled, humans advanced. Where others prayed, humans prepared. It was a detail the council overlooked, blinded by centuries of their own triumphs. To them, fear had always been enough, and they believed it always would be. The Dominion saw only what it wanted to see, another prey species to be broken, another lesson in submission, another campaign to affirm their supremacy. What they did not see, what they could not yet understand, was that they had finally found the one species for whom fear was not a leash but a forge. The predators who had never known terror were about to discover what it meant to face a rival that did not tremble, did not yield, and did not fear. Humanity was waiting, and with it, the end of the Dominion's certainty. The Kryval Dominion did not waste time when prey was found. Their fleets moved with ritual precision, each invasion beginning with an overwhelming show of force designed to drain courage before a single shot was fired. When they arrived at the edge of Seoul, they expected the same outcome they had always enjoyed: panic, capitulation, and submission. Their warlords believed fear would precede them, that humanity would crumble long before the first Kryval warrior set foot on Earth. Yet, from the moment their ships crossed into the system, something was different. The transmissions that filled the void were not the desperate pleas they anticipated, but firm voices of refusal. The humans did not beg, they warned. The Dominion had never encountered prey that spoke so plainly in the face of annihilation. Threats were delivered, promises of devastation broadcast across every frequency, yet the responses were cold and clipped. Where other races wept or surrendered, the humans simply declared that they would fight. To the Kryval, it was both amusing and irritating, like a cornered animal baring its teeth despite having no chance of survival. Their commanders pressed forward with more aggression, confident that the show of overwhelming power would shatter that facade. The first engagement occurred near the orbit of Mars, where Kryval warships confronted a formation of human vessels. The Dominion's technology was centuries ahead, its weapons capable of tearing through steel with little effort. By all logic, the humans should have broken instantly. Instead, the engagement became a test of willpower. Human ships fought with a recklessness that unsettled even the most hardened Kryval officers. They rammed when shields failed, detonated reactors deliberately to take enemy cruisers with them, and maintained tight formations even when annihilation seemed certain. There was no panic, no desperation, only grim determination. The spectacle was so alien to the Dominion that the warlords monitoring the battle assumed their subordinates were misreporting. When survivors returned with recordings, the truth could not be denied. The humans did not flinch in the face of certain death. They did not scatter as prey always did. They pressed forward. The psychological impact was immediate. For the first time in memory, Kryval commanders began to question whether intimidation alone would be enough. Soldiers accustomed to watching enemies collapse under their gaze found themselves facing opponents who glared back with unshaken resolve. The Dominion escalated its efforts. They broadcast the destruction of captured colonies, paraded corpses across the stars, and unleashed their most terrifying weapons in displays of dominance. The intent was clear: to crush any spark of resistance by drowning humanity in the same terror that had subdued countless others. Yet the humans remained unmoved. Their responses were not pleas for mercy but stark promises of retaliation. Instead of fear, there was an unsettling calm, a readiness to endure whatever storm approached. The psychology of the Dominion had no defense against this. Their entire empire had been built on the foundation that fear was universal, that every species could be broken once it recognized the futility of resistance. But humanity, though primitive in comparison, did not acknowledge that truth. They absorbed losses, counted their dead, and continued to fight with the same intensity. In strategy meetings, Kryval officers whispered uneasily that something was different this time. Fear had always been their blade, but against this enemy it seemed to strike air. Even as human ships fell in the hundreds, their actions carried a weight far beyond their material strength. The choice to resist in the face of overwhelming odds was not rational, but it was powerful. It was a message written in blood and fire: humanity would not submit, no matter the cost. That defiance unsettled the predators more than any weapon could. For the first time, the Dominion's leaders found themselves asking questions they had never asked before. What if fear did not work? What if their greatest weapon had no effect on this prey? The clash at Mars ended as expected, with the Dominion's forces victorious, but it was a hollow victory. They had crushed fleets, but they had not crushed will. The reports were clear: humanity had fought to the last, unbroken, and had promised to rise again. It was a precedent the Kryval had never faced, and though they dismissed it publicly as insignificant, in private their certainty wavered. They had always believed that terror was absolute, but now, in the cold silence of space, they began to wonder if they had discovered a species that could not be cowed. The Kryval believed resistance could be worn down with persistence, that even the most stubborn prey would eventually collapse under sustained pressure. Yet the more they pressed against humanity, the more disturbing the encounters became. Every battlefield revealed a pattern unlike anything in the Dominion's long history of conquest. Where others fled, humans adapted. Where others surrendered, humans calculated. Defeat did not seem to break them, it taught them. The predators found themselves in conflict not with frightened prey but with an adversary that learned at impossible speed and returned each engagement sharper, harder, and more relentless than before. Human strategy defied convention. Kryval fleets were accustomed to predictable opposition, carefully measured defenses, orderly retreats, or desperate charges that dissolved in chaos. But humanity turned unpredictability into a weapon. Ambushes appeared in the most unlikely voids of space, traps were laid using debris fields, and seemingly reckless maneuvers revealed themselves as calculated sacrifices. Entire destroyers hurled themselves into larger cruisers, reactors ignited deliberately to drag Dominion ships into the abyss. To the Kryval, such acts bordered on insanity, yet they achieved results that raw firepower alone could not. It was not merely technology being wielded against them but willpower sharpened into a spear. Reports from ground campaigns carried an even darker weight. Kryval warriors, long used to watching populations scatter, found themselves mired in conflicts that bled them slowly and painfully. Human defenders used terrain with uncanny mastery. Forests became killing grounds filled with mines and traps. Cities turned into mazes where every alley might conceal a sniper, every building a death trap. Entire platoons vanished into the ruins of shattered suburbs, cut apart by small, determined squads that fought long after their supplies should have run out. Dominion veterans whispered of opponents who would not stop even when disarmed, who fought with stones, blades, or their bare hands rather than yield. To creatures who defined themselves as the galaxy's ultimate predators, such defiance was incomprehensible. What shook them most was the psychology of their foe. Fear was absent where it should have been omnipresent. Captured soldiers stared at their tormentors with eyes that did not plead but promised vengeance. Prisoners who should have broken under interrogation gave nothing but silence, or worse, dark laughter. In one notorious report, a human captive used his final breath not to beg but to mock his executioners, declaring that more would come and that death itself was no obstacle. The account spread among Dominion troops, not as propaganda but as whispered evidence that something unnatural lived within these creatures. Technological inferiority, which should have sealed humanity's doom, became another arena where they turned weakness into strength. Salvaged weapons from fallen Dominion ships reappeared in human hands, altered and reconfigured with astonishing speed. Energy rifles designed to require specialized training were stripped down and repurposed within days. Starship shielding components, once thought impossible to replicate, were rebuilt in crude but functional forms by human engineers working under bombardment. It was as though adaptation itself was embedded in their nature, as instinctive as breathing. The Kryval realized with growing alarm that they were facing not prey but rivals who could twist every encounter into preparation for the next. As battles stretched on, morale among the predators faltered. Officers reported hesitation among their warriors, hesitation that had never existed before. The psychological advantage they had wielded for centuries was slipping away. For the first time, their soldiers fought not with the certainty of hunters but with the unease of prey. Each clash carried the risk of humiliation, each skirmish the possibility of unexpected loss. Where once they had marched with roaring confidence, they now advanced with the lingering memory of human eyes glaring back without fear. The Dominion had always measured strength by the ability to inspire terror. They believed themselves invincible because fear was universal. But against humanity, fear had no grip. Instead, it recoiled upon those who tried to wield it, infecting the predators themselves with doubt. What had begun as another conquest was transforming into a test of survival, and deep within the Dominion's councils, a quiet dread began to take root. Humanity was not merely resisting. They were revealing to the galaxy that the Kryval were not gods, not legends, not unassailable predators. They were mortal, and they had finally encountered a foe that would not bow. Whispers spread through the Dominion like cracks through glass. What began as unease among field commanders grew into panic that could not be contained. The mighty fleets that once traveled the stars as symbols of dread now carried the memory of battles they had not truly won. Victories that should have reaffirmed their supremacy tasted hollow, for the enemy they faced did not act like prey. They fought to the end, they rose again after defeat, and in their defiance they planted a sickness inside the hearts of predators who had never known fear. The Kryval council chambers once echoed with arrogance, each meeting a chorus of mockery at the weakness of others. Now those same halls rang with tension. Reports from the front described engagements where Dominion soldiers hesitated before advancing, glancing over their shoulders as though shadows themselves carried threats. Captains who had never questioned orders began to waver, fearing ambushes from a species that seemed to make danger manifest in every environment. For a coalition that had thrived on intimidation, the shift was catastrophic. Their power had always rested less on numbers and more on the aura of inevitability. That illusion was crumbling, replaced by stories of humans who would not break. Among enslaved populations, a new murmur began to take hold. Where once silence had been the only safe response, whispers of rebellion stirred. The sight of Dominion fleets retreating from even a single engagement inspired hope in peoples who had long forgotten what it felt like. Some smuggled weapons to human fighters, others began to sabotage Dominion supply lines. It was not yet open revolution, but the chain of fear was weakening link by link. The galaxy had watched the Dominion crush countless civilizations, but now it was watching something far more dangerous, the Dominion faltering. Human defiance became legend almost overnight. Tales of Marines holding a mountain pass against impossible odds, of civilian militias luring enemy battalions into traps, of captured warships turned against their masters, all spread faster than Dominion censors could suppress them. Each story added weight to the growing realization that humanity's strength was not in technology but in spirit. Against an enemy that relied entirely on psychological dominance, that spirit was poison. The elders of the Dominion argued furiously. Some demanded total war, a full mobilization to crush this aberration before it spread further. Others urged caution, insisting the humans were beneath consideration, their resistance merely a temporary flare that would soon be extinguished. Yet beneath the bravado, even the most confident voices carried cracks of doubt. The recordings of human defiance played again and again in those chambers, and with each repetition, the predators who had cowed entire galaxies felt their certainty slipping. On the front lines, Dominion troops encountered horrors they had never faced before, not weapons of unimaginable destruction, but the raw persistence of those who refused to quit. A company could obliterate a city only to find themselves hunted in its ruins by survivors who fought with the determination of professional soldiers. A fleet could burn through human defenses, only to suffer crippling losses from ambushes weeks later, orchestrated by forces they thought destroyed. It was not war as the Dominion understood it. It was resistance that stretched beyond reason, driven by a will that could not be extinguished. The shift was undeniable. Fear, once their most devastating weapon, had turned against them. Instead of radiating outward from the Dominion to its enemies, it seeped inward, infecting the predators themselves. Officers began to question their own invincibility. Soldiers dreamt of human eyes that glared without flinching. Warlords who once boasted of trophies found themselves haunted by the thought of facing enemies who welcomed death if it meant striking one more blow. The galaxy had long accepted that the Kryval Dominion was eternal. Now, as word spread of their first retreats, that belief fractured. Subject peoples saw the cracks and began to press against them. Allies wondered whether the Dominion's dominance was truly unshakable. Even within their own ranks, the predators who had once defined themselves by their fearlessness discovered a truth more terrifying than any weapon: humanity had taught them what it meant to be afraid. The Dominion gathered its full might in one last attempt to erase doubt. Every warlord contributed ships, every fleet was summoned, Every reserve was emptied into what they declared would be the decisive campaign. They believed overwhelming force would drown the memory of human defiance, that a final demonstration of power would restore the aura of inevitability that had sustained them for centuries. Yet as the armada assembled, an unease settled over its commanders. Numbers alone no longer carried certainty. Their enemies had shown that sheer size did not break them, it only hardened their resolve. When the fleets advanced, they found not a broken prey waiting but an adversary that had grown sharper with every encounter. Human forces were still outnumbered, still outgunned, but they fought as if the disparity did not exist. They carried with them the support of species that had once been silent slaves, emboldened now by the sight of predators faltering. What began as isolated alliances had become a tide, and for the first time in living memory, the Dominion was not feared but hunted. The great battle that followed was unlike anything recorded in Dominion history. Every tactic the predators employed was met with ingenuity that turned the momentum against them. Where they unleashed massive barrages, human ships split into scattered formations, striking from impossible angles. Where they deployed overwhelming ground forces, they were met with coalitions of liberated peoples fighting beside humans, armed with weapons forged from the wreckage of Dominion arrogance. Each attempt to impose terror only reminded them that fear had lost its hold. What broke them was not the scale of human firepower, but the unyielding advance of will. Dominion soldiers who had once marched with pride now faltered at the sound of human transmissions echoing across every channel. Calm voices spoke not of surrender but of judgment. Death was not wielded as a threat but as a promise that humans themselves were ready to embrace. Against such resolve, the predators began to fracture. Ships fled from the lines, commanders abandoned posts, and the carefully woven image of unstoppable hunters collapsed in full view of the galaxy. The final blow came not in a single strike but in the collective realization that they were no longer feared. Entire fleets dissolved, not from destruction but from despair. Warlords who once gloried in their supremacy now tasted the dread they had inflicted on others. Their soldiers trembled at the thought of close combat with humans who seemed to welcome it. Victory slipped through their claws, and in its place came the corrosive certainty that their reign had ended. As word spread of the Dominion's failure, uprisings erupted across their territories. Worlds long chained by terror rose in defiance, aided by humans who carried not the banner of conquest but of liberation through struggle. The psychological foundation of the empire disintegrated. Where fear once silenced billions, now courage spread like wildfire, fueled by the knowledge that the predators were not invincible. Humanity had proven it by facing them without flinching, by standing where others had fallen, by refusing to yield even when destruction seemed certain. For the Kryval, the legacy of domination collapsed into ash. They had spent centuries believing themselves eternal, but their downfall came from a truth they had dismissed as impossible. There existed a species immune to fear's chains. The galaxy no longer saw them as apex predators but as broken tyrants fleeing from those they once hunted. Humanity had not only survived, they had rewritten the order of power. In the aftermath, silence returned to the Dominion's former strongholds, but it was no longer the silence of oppression. It was the silence that follows the end of an age. Across the stars, the story spread. Predators who had ruled through terror had discovered what it meant to be prey. The galaxy would never again believe in their supremacy, for humans had shown that true strength was not in the power to frighten but in the refusal to be frightened. The words repeated in every tongue, carried on every broadcast, etched into memory as both warning and promise. Predators knew no fear until they faced humanity.